If you play Warhammer 40k or, well, I guess any tabletop war game, then you've probably come across the need for objective markers. And while yes, we can essentially use anything for these, we can use pennies, we can use biscuits, or we can use the cardboard examples that Games Workshop do provide, it's sometimes nice to have something a little bit more thematic. So, conveniently, Games Workshop make bases the same size as their objective markers, and what that means is we can jump into our bits box, dig out a few spare parts from either our army or scenery kits, and then make up some nice, really cool objective markers. And we're going to go through these 4 examples right now. Let's start off with a military or Astra Militarum themed marker. This is going to be using some components from the Astra Militarum as well as Genestealer Cult kits. First, we have the Saboteur model from the Genestealer Cults, and this has a lovely explosive pack display for the base. We are going to be using that and then mounting it onto a base for our marker. And then what we're going to do is build out some Astra Militarum valuables. In this case, we're going to have a pack of las cells as well as popping in a sandbag just to fill up a little bit of space. When this is all glued down, we can then come in with some texture paste and then apply this over all of the remaining areas of the base to set a nice scene for us. Now, I know that not everyone is like me. I tend to not use any of the sculpted basing details that you get in the kits. So things like the Genestealer Cult is a really good example. The actual explosive part that we're using in this is just a separate component on the sprue, and you can mount it to the base for flavor. I've chosen not to do that. I prefer to fit my armies in with an existing scheme, lore, planet, and things like that. So quite often, if I've got any of these sorts of mounting accessories, I just chop them off and then I tend to put them in my bits box, which is really convenient because now they're on a really cool base. So it's worth keeping things like that if you have the similar sort of habit. Don't just cut them off the sprue and then throw them away if you're not going to be using them. Equally, there's loads of smaller bits that come in things like combat patrols where you're not going to use all of the elements, and essentially we can use some of those as spares if you haven't got an abundance of spare bits in a bits box. With that base essentially built, we can move across to building a second base which is perfect as well for Astra Militarum, and this is going to be modelled on a resource supply area. What we're going to do is take some of the crates that come in the Astra Militarum combat patrol, and then we can essentially stack these up for this base. To start off, we're going to want to lay down a decent amount of texture paste. And that's because we want to get a decent full coverage, as we're going to have a fair few elements on this base. This also allows us to push down certain elements into the texture paste, meaning that we don't need to glue them down initially. So what we're going to be doing is putting down 3 various crates alongside some bedrolls and sidearms. Any elements that sit on top of other plastic elements will need to be glued down with plastic glue, while anything pushed into the texture paste should be held firm with the paste itself. So it's just a case of placing the crates in a nice looking arrangement. So here we're going for a lid open, resting against another crate that's on its edge. To finish off the objective marker, we can also then take, in this case, the wrapped las gun and then glue this to the lid of the case, making it look like it's available to be reloaded and taken out to battle. For this objective marker, we did need to make some arrangements to the crate. In this case, we had to take a second door panel or lid of a crate and then attach it to the bottom of one. And that's because the ones for the combat patrol that come for, I believe it was the artillery kits and things like that, essentially don't have a bottom. It's just a hole because you're meant to glue it to the base. So what we had to do is come in and just glue one on either side so it looks like a completely solid case. And that essentially solves it out. And the way that I kind of approach this is having a story, lore, or some sort of reason behind what we're building out. So for these two, it's relatively obvious. They're military themed, they're Imperial Guard themed to a degree. We've got resources, and if you're an Imperium player, you would want to grab your resources and keep them so you could have the fight. Whereas if you're against the Imperial player, you might want to take the resources away from them so they can't hurt you. Similar thing with the first base with the resources and a bomb. Naturally, the Imperium are going to want to get there to defuse the bomb to ensure that their resources are safe, while the enemy are going to want the bomb to go off. So it's a nice way of building in a reason as to why we've got certain aspects on the markers, essentially. Similar to when we're building out stories and bases for our models themselves. But what if you don't want an Imperial Guard one? What if you want something that's either more Space Marine themed or possibly just generally Imperium themed? Because as we know, no good Space Marine should be left behind. So why don't we tackle this Dead Blood Angels on a base that we need to go and get the Gene Seed from? This marker is going to be built again on one of the base accessories, this time from the Space Marines Apothecary. Conveniently, we have a sculpted Dead Space Marine in this kit, which is completely separate to the rest of the model. So we can take this and glue it to a base. We do need to make sure that we fill the chest hole on this model, so when we go in, we can touch it up with painting later on and you can't notice the cavity. But we can go a little bit further than just slapping this on a base. We can take a little bit of plaster of Paris, break it into chunks and small amounts of rubble. These pieces of rubble can then be glued down across the base using super glue, and we can also take some time to add additional other elements to tie it into the environment. In this case, we are going to be adding a large I-beam that is laying across the model before we hold it down with a little bit more rubble. This rubble, as I said, was made up from some plaster of Paris that we then broke up into small rubbly chunks. And I generally don't like working with plaster of Paris normally, mainly because it's very crumbly and it causes a lot of dust and issues. But there is something I discovered not too long ago, probably a year or two ago, where you can kind of enhance the properties of plaster of Paris slightly and get a slightly better result that's more resilient and gives us a better effect. And how we did that was essentially to mix some PVA glue, or I've heard wood glue also works, mixing that into the water before we then mix up our ratio of plaster of Paris. And essentially what it tends to do is harden the plaster of Paris and make it slightly more resilient. And it also makes it act a little bit more like China. So you tend to know it's in there because it makes the kind of tinging and ringing that China does, but naturally it's still plaster. So it just makes it a little bit easier to work with because it's not breaking, snapping and crumbling as we're working through it. Obviously, we chose for just a generic base here. We went for an I-beam covering the Space Marine. This could be swapped out for something specific to your army. Say you are an Orc player. You could paint the Space Marine as your opponent's army and then lay a Orc vehicle piece on top of it, making it look like it's been killed in an Orc battle. So it's really easy to theme this up. We just went for something nice and generic here, which was a Dead Blood Angel. Talking of it being a Blood Angel, before we tackle the fourth marker, let's do some painting on these. And that's because most of them are using similar steps. And we're going to start off by grabbing a dark brown contrast, using this across all of the texture paste areas of the marker, as well as picking out any elements that we are going to be painting as metal later on. Mainly here we're looking at locks on all of the crates, any weapons, the I-beam that is resting on the Space Marine. Once all of this is dry, we can go around and highlight all of the ground and the rubble using a quick overbrush of warm flesh. This will nice and quickly pick out all of the details and textures that we've built in across the marker. Up until this point, it was very important that we tried not to get any of the brown contrast on any of the bits that we didn't say, so essentially any of the bits of metal or the ground. And the reason for that is because we're going to be coming in and using contrast for other elements. Mainly, we're going to be using red for weapons crates, and I was thinking of using a green for something like utility, so bed rolls and things like that. However, turns out I don't have a green contrast. I've only got a blue and a yellow. So if only there was some way I could fix this. Once we've picked out all of our chosen contrast colors, it's then just a case of applying these colors over our chosen locations. Starting with the red for us, we're going to be applying this to all of the weapons crates. As I said, we're also opting to make the dead Marine look like a dead Blood Angel. So naturally, he also needs a coat of red. Then we can take our magically appearing green and use this to pick out some of the closed crates. That's because we can't see the contents, so we could easily explain that these contain utility items like bedrolls and MREs. On the subject of bedrolls and MREs, we can also give all of these ancillary items a coat of green as well. Once we're happy with all of the non-metallic areas being painted, we can take a gold metal paint and apply this over all of the metal areas. Here we're looking at all of the bits like buckles on the cases, the I-beams and the las cells. Once all of that is perfectly dry, we can finish it all off nicely by giving it a healthy coat of brown wash. Once that wash is dry, the first 3 of our 4 bases are sorted, and this is really quick to produce, it's really nice, and it looks a lot better than just using a penny, a biscuit or a token, and it's just using spare pieces. If you're using spare pieces, don't probably go and buy kits just for this, but I guess you could if you wanted. But now let's move swiftly on to the 4th one, and that is a nice ritual summoning demons site, which naturally would be of interest for Imperium, be interest for Chaos, and probably also most Xenos. Equally, I would probably use similar things to this in D&D because it's just a generic sort of demon summoning ritual site. And we are using the Infernal Master's little beast that comes out of the front of his twirly spell, so we've got that for the predominant feature. But we're also using an Imperial icon and a spear topper from a Chaos Knight. And that's not the 40k Chaos Knight, the really big cool one. That's the 40k Knights from Old World that are horsemen, the actual knights, not big robots. But anyway, with all of those pieces ticked off, we can actually get to work on the marker itself. We can take all of these parts and then start to assemble them. First, we are going to put down some basing material so that we don't have to try to work in and around the larger elements. Then we can take our corrupted Imperial artifact. Here we have a winged skull that came from, I believe, the Imperial Guard Combat Patrol. And then we glued the Chaos Star to the top of it before we then added that to the base. The idea here is that we want the scene to look like a desecrated relic that has started summoning demons. Once those elements are stuck down, we want to come in and add the spell effect. We're using the one that comes with the Thousand Suns leader, and this is a great little circling spell summoning some Tzeentch beasts. We can stick these down and use plastic glue to mount the Tzeentch stingrays to the swirling effect. And then we can also use the star as a support for our stingrays as well, gluing this in place, which will give it a nice held down structure. And for the build, it is as simple as that. It's a really quick one to do. It only takes 4 pieces, well, 3 pieces if you class the stingray and the spell effect that come from the same kit as 1 piece. And that is it. You can understand why, lore-wise, this would be really, really cool. You've got a demon being summoned from a heretical relic that is actually manifesting dirt into demons. That's going to be of interest for everyone. Everyone's going to want to either help it, stop it, or just study it. So let's get to the actual painting of this guy. And we're going to be using contrast primarily. The dirt and the metals are going to be the same as before, just so that it ties in with the rest of it. So let's mainly focus on the stingray and the spell effect. Quickly skipping over the painting for the earth, we, as I said, achieved it the same as all of the others. But when we did the overbrushing, we actually changed this out for a stippling effect. This helps to build out the effect of that rotation of the spell effect. Then we painted the Chaos Star in gold along with the relic icon, the same as everything else with a brown contrast and a gold layer. Now we can move on to the truly fun bit, the painting of a quick demon. What we're going to do is start by applying a range of contrast paints. We need the brown contrast paint that we used for the base. We need a dark red as well as a bright red. And what we can do is start to wet blend these from top to bottom. We want to use the brown dirt and blend from the ground up through the stingray, going from brown through dark red up to bright red at the very top of the stingray. This should give us a really smooth transition from the general dirt tone that we've used on the base pulled up through to the bright red. However, you may be thinking, but generally Tzeentch aren't red. Red is more corn, Tzeentch is more blues and purples. Well, I can see what you're thinking there, and that's why we're going to be using some blue contrast later on down the line. But first, we're going to need to pick out some of the details on our stingray before we do. These steps include starting off with a dry brush, and we want to use a light blue on this first dry brushing round. And we want to target essentially all of the spell effect and stingray areas of this particular marker. This will leave our really nice wet blending in all of the recesses, while giving us a really strong color change on the raised edges. This means that we can then come in with a second lighter round of dry brush. This time we're going to be using an ivory or off-white style, and this will lightly pick out all of the upper edges, giving us a bright thing to work from when we come to tinting. And the tinting will come in a form of a thinned blue contrast, which can be applied over the whole spell effect and left to dry, as long as we make sure that we don't have too much pooling in the recesses. Once that is dry, the contrast tints the rest of the model really nicely, and that's what turns it from the red into more of a Tzeentch feel. The blue tints all of the red into a nice purple, and obviously everywhere that we dry brushed with a blue and a white stays that crisper, brighter blue, so we get a really nice transition and a nice recessed purple look. Overall, that is all of the bases done, and we can whip these up really quickly. I'm sure in less time than it takes you to paint a combat patrol or a unit, you could take spares from those kits and build up 2 sets of 6 objective markers that are suitable for you or your opponent, whether you're playing at home, playing narrative, or even playing at a tournament. Anything is really possible, and obviously, as I said, a lot of this is about building stories in your mind, and it's essentially just a really nice playground that we can use to build mini themes, mini dioramas, and also potentially test out different painting techniques. So this is how they come out overall, and I do really like how they came out for the amount of time that we spent, and I really do hope that this has kind of inspired you to potentially spend a little bit of time making up really cool markers like these ones. And as I said, we were using a lot of spare pieces from kits that I've painted up and just not used those accessories for. Things like the Saboteur, I don't use the bomb that came with the Saboteur, and I used it in a different way. And if you want to see what way I used that and how it came out in the end, why not check out this video here? Otherwise, do remember to subscribe so that we can see you next time.